Good afternoon. Welcome to this panel, which is sponsored by the Church in the 21st Century Project at Boston College. This is a 2-year project to respond positively to the sex abuse events which were revealed, let's say, didn't transpire, but were revealed within the Catholic Church over the past couple of years. And the Church in the 21st Century Project is attempting to respond to what some have called a crisis along 3 axes. So we have 3 subcommittees. One is on roles and responsibilities in the church. Another is on passing on the faith. And the third, of which this panel is an example, is sexuality. I am one of the co-chairs of the Sexuality Committee, and the other is John Garvey, who is Dean of the Law School. My name is Lisa Soul Cahill, and I teach theology here at Boston College. The 2 panelists, whom I will introduce to you more fully in a moment, are Christina Trena and Chris Kazor. Kazor, is that correct? Thank you. We have already had a phone conversation, and they have exchanged papers. So for us, or for our committee, we are hoping that that will model the kind of, my co-chair, John Garvey, just came in. That's right there. We're hoping that this will model the kind of discussion in the Catholic Church about controversies in sexual ethics, which is too rarely seen but very much needed, I think at least. And that is a conversation where people come together, try to find common ground, to see what they share in common, without concealing their differences, but at the same time hoping to learn more from one another. The 2 panelists this afternoon have prepared 20-minute presentations. Both of them have chosen the idea of virtue, and virtue as it applies to sexuality and marriage as their point of departure. As you listen carefully, you'll see that the way they approach this and define this would, of course, also lead to some differences in the way they would approach concrete issues in sexual ethics. But despite that fact, they share a tradition, they share some concerns, and hopefully by listening to the interaction between them, we also will learn more about the subject area this afternoon. So, with that, I'll introduce the 2 of them, and the first to speak will be Christopher Kazor, and after him, Christina Trena. Chris is a professor of philosophy at Loyola Marymount University. He is a graduate of the honors program here at Boston College. I'm on the honors program faculty, so that's very good to know. And he graduated in 1992. After that, he obtained his PhD degree at the University of Notre Dame, working both with the Department of Philosophy and the Medieval Institute. And then, subsequent to that, he had a Fulbright in Cologne, Germany. He has an edited book and a monograph already published on proportionalism and the natural law tradition. The proportionalism, for those of you who aren't theologians and graduate students in theology, I see many of you, but it's a debate within Catholicism primarily about how to formulate and reformulate moral rules. So it does pertain to issues of sexual ethics, which we'll be talking about more specifically today. He also has 2 books coming out. One is on abortion, and the other is on bioethics, entitled The Edge of Life, Human Dignity and Contemporary Bioethics. Professor Trena is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Religious Studies at Northwestern University in Chicago, and she earned her BA degree from Princeton and completed her PhD work at the University of Chicago. She has a book that has been published on a topic somewhat similar to Professor Kazor's in that it's on natural law and also treats Aquinas, but it is called Natural Law and Feminist Ethics, The End of the Anathemas. So you can see from that title that it already is an approach to bring together 2 different ways of thinking and approaches to theology that are sometimes viewed as being at odds with one another. In addition, she is working on another book on maternal experience, the experience of mothers, and the boundaries of sexual ethics, and that is projected to be published with the University of Chicago Press. So for the first 20 minutes, please join me in welcoming and listening to Professor Kazor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I'm really delighted to be here. As she said, I graduated in '92, so today was a trip down memory lane. I went by the Walsh Hall where I used to live, in Edmonds, and the Newton campus, and all around. And I remember actually two very interesting lectures that took place here. My freshman year, Alan Bloom came, and there was a huge shouting match between him and Paul Briney's. And then I remember Faye Waddleton came from Planned Parenthood. And again, another sort of electrifying evening. Now, if I can generate half as much enthusiasm as either one of those speakers, then I'll be very lucky. Today, what I want to talk about are reflections on marital love and the procreation of children. And so what I'll do is briefly talk about three different kinds of love. And in particular, I'll be focusing on erotic love and how we understand that. And then finally, I'll talk about how erotic love is related to the procreation of children. Okay. So three kinds of love. The Greeks spoke of eros, erotic love, sexual love, and we'll say a little bit more about what that is. And they also talked about philia, a sort of friendship. It has to be mutual. Unlike erotic love, in erotic love, one person can be in love with another without the love being reciprocated. In friendship, if one person isn't friendly back, then there is no friendship. It has to be a two-way street, as Aristotle reminded us. And then finally, of course, there's a love of agape, sort of self-giving, self-sacrificial love. And again, this sort of love does not need to be mutual. So what sort of love is in a marriage? Is it a love based on eros? Is it a love of philia? Is it a love of agape? Well, in fact, I think in a good marriage, all three loves are present. But in today's discussion, what I want to really focus on is not the love of friendship that hopefully can be there in a marriage, where husband and wife are best friends, and not even the love of agape, where one spouse gives to the other in a very self-generous, unconditional way. But rather, I want to focus on erotic love and its relationship to procreation. So what is eros? A preliminary investigation. Here is C.S. Lewis, and he drew a distinction between three different elements that he thought it was important to keep separate. We have being in love, and that's what he means by eros. When you say, I'm in love with so-and-so, that's something you only say about eros. You don't say you're in love with your father or mother, you're in love with your brother, you're in love with your children, but you are in love with your beloved, the one you have eros for. Now, Lewis distinguishes this from Venus and from mere sexuality. So mere sexuality can exist without any eros. So say the prostitute has no eros, presumably, for her customers. But Venus is the conjunction of the two, that is to say, sexuality within the context of being in love. Now, Lewis said quite a bit about eros, but we need to explore it a little bit more deeply, and explore in particular the ways in which eros and mere sexuality or mere physical attraction are similar, and the ways that they are dissimilar. So how are mere sexuality and being in love, how are they similar? Well, they have a number of similarities. The first you might call intensity. If you're in love, or you find someone very attractive, they grip your attention. Right? If your beloved walks in the room, everyone else seems to disappear from the room. You have an interest, an enduring desire to know more about the person, to be with the person, to see the person, to interact with the person. Eros and physical attraction also share passion. And by passion, I'm not talking about Mel Gibson's movie. I'm talking about the sense of it's something that happens to you. We speak of being in love and falling in love as if it's something that accidentally happens. And isn't that so? If you fall in love with someone, you can't control that. It just happens to you. And the same thing is true with finding someone attractive. You can't control that. I mean, imagine if I said to someone in the audience, well, I'd like you to find very attractive the gentleman sitting behind you. Right? Can you do that? I want you to fall in love with him. Go ahead. Right? You can't do that. It's impossible. So being in love and being attracted to someone is something that happens to you. A third similarity is the idea of love at first sight. And we might also talk of attraction at first sight. It is possible, of course, to fall in love with someone that you've known for some time and you weren't in love with to begin with. But often it's said that right away, when you find the one, you know it. And similarly with physical attraction. Sometimes, again, someone grows on you and you grow to find them attractive. But often it's the case that as soon as they walk in the door, as soon as you talk to them for a few minutes, you find them attractive right away. A fourth similarity is brevity of duration. And by that I mean that just as love can begin with a glance, erotic love can end before 9.5 weeks is done. Right? So they both share this brevity of duration. And finally, both being in love and mere sexuality desires sexual intercourse. It doesn't really make sense to say, I'm madly in love with so-and-so, and if you were asked, well, do you want to make love with so-and-so? Well, no. Never crossed my mind. I mean, that doesn't even really make sense. I mean, if you're in love with someone, or you find them incredibly attractive, you would at least desire sexual intercourse. Now, that doesn't mean you'd actually do it, but you'd at least desire that. Now, even though there are these similarities, it seems to me there are also very important differences, and I want to talk about those differences next. The first difference, I might say, is that, as I say, being in love, you yearn for sexual acts. But mere sexuality, on the other hand, is exhausted in sexual acts. That's really all it wants. Being in love, you seek the beloved alone. Now, in mere sexual attraction, you don't really seek one person necessarily. You seek whoever would be there to give you what you want, the pleasure. When you're in love, you want the love to endure forever. Whereas sexual attraction, on the other hand, seeks the partner right away. There's a sense of only the present counting and not really caring or thinking too much about forever. Another difference is being in love is a preoccupation with the whole person. If you're in love, you love the way the person writes letters. You love their handwriting. You love the way they eat. You love all these little things that no one else would notice, but you really love that about them. Now, mere sexuality, on the other hand, is a preoccupation with the person as sexual partner, actual sexual partner or potential. Another difference, being in love is centered on the beloved. It's contemplative, as Lewis said. You want to look at the beloved and your love is centered on that. Whereas mere sexuality is really centered more on yourself. So even though being in love and mere sexuality do have quite a bit in common, as you can see, they also have quite a bit of difference. Now, it has to be said that mere sexuality and the procreation and education of children do not go together very well. In fact, they stand in no small tension with one another. For one thing, there's a great physical toll in having children. There's a cost and there's time required. And this tends to not contribute to physical attraction. It's hard to be attracted to someone or even feel in love with someone when the baby's up at 1 in the morning, you're changing diapers, you're exhausted from everything you've done. Another aspect is that even if sexual attraction isn't undermined by procreation, the education of children may get in the way. But just because this is true, we still have to examine the relationship between procreation and eros. So even if physical attraction is not exactly enhanced by procreation, eros nevertheless might be. So let's move on to that. Again, to the question, what is erotic love? Lewis gave us a little sketch, but I think we need to go much deeper than that. And what I'd like to do is turn to a great dialogue in philosophy, that is Plato's Symposium. Now, Plato's Symposium is a dialogue in which a number of friends and former and present lovers sit around together, drink, and talk and praise of love. And the various speeches given are not always compatible with one another, but it's done in a very interesting setting where, at least according to some commentators, the speeches are meant not only to tell us something about love, but also to attract and seduce the other members of the drinking party. Now, most commentators say that of all the speeches in the symposium, the very best speech is that given by Aristophanes, as you see in the quotation I have up on the board there. Plato makes Aristophanes the expositor of the truest and most satisfying account of Eros that we find in the symposium. There has probably never been a speech or poem about love that so embraces what men and women actually feel when they embrace each other. So here is the speech of, what is the speech of Aristophanes? Well, he says originally there were three kinds of beings, and I have a little picture here of something that's akin to the sort of being he's talking about. He thinks that originally human beings were something like conjoined twins. Joined at the back, as this picture indicates, and originally there were a male-male conjoined twin, so to speak, a circle being, female-female circle being, and then a male-female circle being. So something akin to this. Now, these beings were very powerful. They rebelled against the gods. And so the gods thought about destroying them, but they said, no, let's not destroy them. Let's just weaken them so that we can still retain their services. So that's exactly what they did. They weakened them by punishing them, and the punishment was to be that they were all to be split down the middle. The male-male circle being would be split down the middle, and so on with the other three. Now, as a result of this punishment, eros of three kinds arises. You have, for instance, in this photograph, that being would be split, and from that, homosexual male love would arise. From the female-female circle being, female homosexuality would arise. And then from the male-female, you would get heterosexuality. Now, what does this myth mean? What is its meaning? There's been a great deal of debate about that. Most every commentator agrees that it reveals a great truth about eros, but the agreement ends right there. What is that truth? Bloom, for instance, says that eros is a human affair, neither beastly nor divine. So instead of some of the earlier speeches had said that eros is a god, and then some of the other speeches had made eros into an earthly thing, akin to the way Freud would, that eros is nothing other than base animal instincts and lust. But Bloom says it's between the human and divine. Between the beastly and the divine, a distinctly human thing. Some have seen this speech as comedy. Martha Nussbaum has this to say in her book, The Fragility of Goodness. As we hear Aristophanes' distant myth of this passionate groping and grasping, we are invited to think how odd, after all, it is that bodies should have these holes and projections in them. Odd that the insertion of a projection into an opening should be thought by ambitious and intelligent beings a matter of deepest concern. From the outside, we can't help but laughing. They want to be gods, and here they are, running around, anxiously trying to thrust a piece of themselves into a hole, or perhaps more comical still, waiting in hope that some hole of theirs will have something thrust into it. So she has a sense that this is really showing the comical in eros. But there are other interpretations that emphasize the sexual. That is to say that this myth is about the drive for sexual unity. Alan Bloom has this to say in favor of this interpretation. He says, Aristophanes is the first speech in the symposium that gives an erotic account of eros. He, unlike his predecessors, describes embraces and orgasms. They are what eros is about, and they are splendid as ends in themselves. He is all erotic and shows why people, with their squirmings and their grunts and sweating and all the rest, are doing the best possible thing, the thing that most expresses their nature. Now, Bloom contrasts this view with the Jewish celebration of family and sexuality ordered to reproduction. So really he sees Aristophanes' myth as a radical rejection of the Jewish and later Christian view that eros and reproduction go together. Finally, some have put emphasis, and I'm going to put emphasis on this, that eros is really a desire for unity. At the end of Aristophanes' speech, towards the end, he has this to say as a culminating paragraph of the whole speech about eros. He says, he's talking about the god Hephaestus, the god of ironwork and metallurgy. He says, if Hephaestus with his tools were to stand over a couple in love as they lay in the same place and were to ask, what is it that you want, human beings, to get for yourselves from one another? And if in their perplexity he were to ask them again, is it not that you desire to be with one another in the very same place as much as possible, and not to leave one another day and night? For if you desire that, I am willing to fuse you and make you grow together into the same thing, so that, though two, you would be one. And as long as you lived, you would both be together just as you are one. We know that there would not even be one true lover who, if he heard this, would refuse. And it would be self-evident that he wants nothing else than this. He would quite simply believe that he had heard what he had been desiring all along, in conjunction and fusion with the beloved, to become one from two. Now, if eros is really about this desire for unity, to become one with the beloved, we have to ask ourselves, is eros ultimately tragic? After all, sexual intercourse only partially and for a time fulfills the desire for unity. It can't actually make two people one. And even if you had sexual intercourse going on and on, that doesn't seem to be what we want. In Dante's Inferno, he has Paolo and Francesca in an eternal sexual embrace. So they're having sex forever. And you might think, oh, this must be in heaven, the highest heaven, to have sex forever. Great. No, it's in hell. And isn't that true? Wouldn't it be hellish to be locked in an embrace like that forever? I mean, to make love with your beloved for a while is heavenly, but forever would not be so good. So is eros really ultimately tragic? That is to say, we have this deep desire for unity, we have a deep desire to become one with another person, and we can never do it. Well, can these aspirations be met? It's a little unclear they can be. But there does seem to be one possibility, a way of two becoming one without the two losing their self-identity, a way of unifying themselves without losing themselves completely at the same time. Erotic unity and begetting a child. This is George. This is my kid up there. Now, how does this work? Well, in their offspring, a couple realizes the dream offered to have faces, to be rolled into one, to be fused together, and never to be parted. Each child, my child, every single one of you, is a living sacrament, a sign of the love between two people, hopefully, right? At least the sign of a union between two people, the union of man and woman. So, begetting a child realizes the dream of Eros. And parentage to this child unifies the couple in an exclusive and eternal way. So there's no undoing this unity. So in the begetting of a child, the aims of Eros are made, but also in the education of the child. So again, if Eros is about desiring this unity, the education of children fulfills this desire. Most couples share a unity of affection for their children, obviously, and a unity of goodwill to work for their children's good. Even after a couple has fallen out of love, they maybe hate each other. Still, divorced couples will often act on their best behavior and have a unity of will, goodwill towards their children, and work for their children. Further, there's a unity, characteristically at least, of shared activity in running a household and in raising the children. So the procreation of children creates a unity between the couple, and the education of children creates a unity between the couple. And therefore, the aims of Eros are really realized in the procreation and the education of children. Now, this sounds like a sort of radical idea, but I'm not the first to come up with it, and Aristophanes wasn't. But this idea is reflected in the Christian tradition, in particular in the Second Vatican Council. So Vatican II had this to say about marriage and love. Marriage and conjugal love are by their nature ordained toward the begetting and educating of children. Children are really the supreme gift of marriage and contribute very substantially to the welfare of their parents. Now, we often think of parents contributing very substantially to the welfare of their children, and that's true. A good parent has to look after the child's physical needs, emotional needs, psychological needs, educational needs. But Vatican II here is claiming that children also benefit the parents. It's not just a one-way benefit from parents to children. Children also benefit the parents. And they benefit the parents through realizing the aims of erotic love, creating an eternal unity between the parents that doesn't disturb their individuality and their freedom of being their own unique person. So these two things, at least in the Catholic tradition and also in Aristophanes, go together. And Vatican II really captures the fundamental insights of Aristophanes about Eros more than 20 centuries later. Now, today I haven't talked about the other kinds of love that could be present in marriage. So I haven't talked about friendship, and I haven't talked about agape. And maybe in the question and answer we can talk about that. Because I think also there, in terms of the marital friendship between the couple and in terms of the self-giving love between a couple, children, again, enhance and can be seen as a great gift for marriage. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to talking more with you in the question and answer period. Get this out of the way.
Oh, yeah, I'll take care of that, Christy. So our next speaker is Dr. Christina Reyna.
Good afternoon. I'm somewhat cowed by being here because I know there is someone here who has addressed everything I'm going to say with greater nuance and detail than I have, and it is our hostess. So, with that, I first of all want to thank Professor Kaiser for his description of children as the completion of Eros. I think it is moving, it is poetic, and it is true for all families in which parents are lovingly committed to their children and to each other. It is certainly true in my family. And it is true in a deep down to the bones way that I could not even have imagined when I got married over 20 years ago. However, two things. First of all, it is not always true, and that's something we may want to talk about later. But secondly, I want to say that this claim, in other hands than Professor Kaiser's, often seems designed merely to show that only children complete eros, and that therefore homosexual unions are wrong. This may not be the most pressing issue facing the church today. Rather, thinking globally, I believe it is the question, how should faithful people believe in situations in which sex is being used to wield power over them? This is the question that confronts millions of people the world over, and it is not being asked or answered adequately in our church, despite everything that's happening in the States, and especially in Massachusetts, with the sex crisis in the church. So in order to address this, or to begin to address it actually, I'd like to start with the story of Susanna from the 13th chapter of Daniel, which I hope all of you have now. I can't read it. I'm just going to summarize it. Susanna was married to Joachim, a very wealthy and influential man, and Joachim's two close friends were two unjust judges from Babylon who liked to hear cases in his house. Well, Joachim was also married to a beautiful young woman named Susanna. What happened is that the two judges saw Susanna and they kind of liked her. And they used to hang around at lunchtime, seeing if they could catch a glimpse of her coming out into her garden after all the public had left. And one day they ran into each other. What are you doing here? And they admitted to each other that they were looking for an opportunity to have sex with Susanna. So they try to work out a plan, and one day they sneak into the garden, and lo and behold, Susanna's there. She sends her maids away because she wants to take a bath. They see their opportunity, and they go up to her and say, Susanna, have sex with us, or we will accuse you of having been here with a young man. Well, she knows if she has sex with them, that's adultery. She's likely going to be stoned. If she doesn't have sex with them, she's going to be accused of adultery and she's going to be stoned. So she says, no, I won't. She screams. People come into the garden. The judges tell their story. She is brought to trial. She is found guilty. She's being led off to execution, and suddenly Daniel shows up and says, wait a minute, I can solve this. He separates the judges and gets them to tell different versions of the story, proving that they're liars and Susanna is saved. Okay? This is the story. Let's lay aside for a moment the fact that the real point of the story is not Susanna, it's Daniel. Okay. What do Susanna's actions mean, though? In Veritatis Splendor, Pope John Paul II interpreted the story in this way. Susanna, preferring to fall innocent into the hands of the judges, bears witness not only to her faith and trust in God, but also to her obedience to the truth and to the absoluteness of the moral order. By her readiness to die a martyr, she proclaims that it is not right to do what God's law qualifies as evil in order to draw some good from it. Susanna chose for herself the better part. Hers was a perfectly clear witness, without any compromise, to the truth about the good and to the God of Israel. By her acts, she revealed the holiness of God. In his view, the judges were tempting Susanna to adultery. She resisted the temptation, risking death. End of story. Well, any of you who has experienced sexual coercion, or who knows anyone who has, may feel rather odd about leaving the story here. What I would like to do today is to point out why this interpretation is not adequate to situations of sexual coercion, and what additional interpretive tools the Church already possesses that we could dust off and use to comfort and to enable the victims of sexual coercion. The question is, how are we to handle sexual victimization as faithful Christians? What lies behind Pope John Paul's II interpretation of Susanna is something praiseworthy. His breathtaking belief in the ecstatic potential of sex in marriage. No pope has celebrated the beauty of marital sexuality more profoundly than John Paul II. For him, sex is all about the depth and complexity of marital commitment. He calls couples to embody Christ for each other. to open their love generously to the huge and unknowable task of bearing children and raising them, and to enact these promises lovingly in the concrete and mysterious act of sex. For him, shared sexual pleasure and intercourse confirms and strengthens a couple's commitment. It reinforces their emotional bond. It brings joy, and it recalls or maybe even bestows sacramental grace. It's impossible to exaggerate the significance of this position for a church in which, until very recently, sexual intercourse was supposed to upset the passions so very much, upset rationality so much, that it tolerated sex only for the sake of procreation. It would be terrible, except that it makes babies. Okay? This vision of Pope John Paul II's reflects a healthy egalitarian sexuality of the kind that Professor Kaiser has shared with us. It affirms the integrity of body and spirit. It affirms the connection between sex and parenthood. It explains why John Paul II sees Susanna's case as a case of adultery averted. For Susanna to consent, right, would be symbolically to break her holistic union with Joachim through symbolic physical union with other men. The question is this the only issue at stake? Is this the only way to interpret the story? And I would say no. However much the Roman Catholic vision of sex is about bond and about vocation, it is also about personal virtue and about social justice. The Susanna story throws in hints of these alternatives, and without them, I think, our moral analysis of that story is not complete. I'm going to, in what follows, try to do two jobs simultaneously in a short time, which is explain the traditions that I think are so useful and what they mean for the story of Susanna, but also say a tiny bit about what they might mean if they were developed further, how they might help us. The first one's individual virtue, because Christian ethics of sexuality is not just about me and my partner, as a whole. Okay? It's also about my moral and spiritual growth as an individual. It's about me as a sexual person making my way through the messy and incomplete circumstances that my life presents me with. Two kinds of questions arise traditionally, okay, for individual sexual virtue. One is vocation. In other words, am I going to be celibate or am I going to be married? Where is God inviting me? And the other one is very closely related, and that's chastity, which is a special case of temperance. And temperance is the habit that moderates especially desires of touch, traditionally food, drink, and sex. Conventional wisdom, and even most recently the Da Vinci Code, if you've read it, create the impression that in Roman Catholicism, temperance is about cultivating hatred for these desires and pleasures. And contemporary American experience suggests, though, that this is a mistake. Extreme self-denial that's based on revulsion is destructive. It leads either to illness and death, as in anorexia, or it leads to obsession and binging. Okay? Theology agrees. We believe that God has constructed us so that meeting basic bodily needs is by and large pleasurable, so that our desires prompt us to do what's good for us. The point of true temperance is to calm and channel our desires so that they lead us to enjoy just the right amount of what is good for us, rather than letting desire overpower us and overpower our freedom and destroy us. This might mean, for example, that you enjoy and even look forward to pepperoni pizza when it's served without feeling the need to call pizza delivery every night at midnight. Okay? And it might also mean giving pizza up for Lent, but especially looking forward to and enjoying an Easter afternoon, or maybe even after the Easter Vigil, trip to whatever pizza parlor is open, right, to break your fast. Well, temperate desires and pleasures also take surroundings and neighbors into account. They have to be appropriate to the social and cultural situation. The first time I went to visit my husband's Mennonite grandmother, I had a huge plate full of sausage, sauerkraut, and mashed potatoes. I was stuffed, but you know what? I had to have a second helping because it would have offended her. Did I act against temperance? No, the social situation said I needed to eat a little more, okay? Another one is, I think it's important for me, if I can afford to buy organic food. Why? out of concern for my neighbors who pick it, okay? Also, temperate desires and pleasures have to avoid deflecting our time, our attention, our resources away from other important obligations we have to ourselves, to our families, to our community. If I'm spending my entire week running around my hometown looking for organic food so that I don't have to buy anything that was chemically fertilized, I don't have time to be a political activist. I don't have time to help my kids with their homework, right? I don't have time to talk to my husband. That would be bad too. If we treated sex like food, we'd expect to say that being distracted by sexual desire, spending too much time preparing for sex, having sex too often, having it too rarely, obsessing over it, and being repulsed by it would all be intemperate. And to a degree, this is true of the tradition. Okay? So let's do a quick inventory of the story from this point of view. Who was unchaste? Well, the judges were unchaste. They began to lust for her, which would not be so bad in itself because good things should attract us, except that they suppressed their consciences, feeding their desire intentionally. Even worse, they let their preoccupation get in the way of their obligations to other people. It says they did not keep in mind just judgments. They started messing up their work. Caught in their lust, instead of being ashamed, they decided to look for an occasion when they could meet her alone. Now we have a conspiracy. And finally, they used their power and their influence to blackmail her. Then they prosecuted her, lied about the whole incident, practically succeeded in putting her to death. They were so cruel, and their consciences were so dead, that they made her partially disrobe just so they could leer at her before they killed her. Okay? If we ever needed a moral tale about the extremes to which unbridled lust can lead, this is it. Clearly, the judges have no problem with deficient desire, so let's look at Susanna. Did she lust? No, she was God-fearing, unlike the judges who avoided turning their eyes upward. She just wanted a bath. Was she enticed sexually by the judges' advances? Again, no. She was anguished at the trap, they said. She screamed. Is there any indication that she found sex repulsive generally? No. Did she wield any power over the judges or gain anything for herself, either by agreeing to sex or by refusing it? No, she didn't. We have to look at her words carefully here, and I think maybe even more carefully than John Paul II. She was utterly powerless. I am completely trapped, Susanna groaned. If I yield, it will be my death for committing adultery. If I refuse, I cannot escape your power. That is, death again. Yet it is better for me to fall into your power without guilt than to sin before the Lord. Now, if acquiescence here was a sin, it clearly would not have been a sin against temperance as I've defined it so far. Susanna was not resisting sexual temptation. Okay? Rather, she had received a death sentence. She was in checkmate. But she found a way to assert her dignity. What she was really saying was, if you are determined to kill me, at least let me die unviolated rather than violated. And then she guaranteed this by screaming. Why then does John Paul II see her as a potential adulterer? I think there are two related reasons other than the one I've given already about two-ness. The first is that the tradition historically handles chastity differently from temperance generally, because it combines it right away with the theology of marriage. Unlike food and drink, sex is not thought to be essential to every individual's health. Okay? Its purpose is to serve humanity through procreation, not the individual. Because not everyone is called to parenting, not everyone is called to use their sexuality genitally. So excessive sex, in this case, in the traditional interpretation, is not too much sex for my health, but any use of intercourse that doesn't at least potentially benefit humanity through marital procreation. In this very narrow vision, Susanna would have been guilty if she had consented, right? Because she would have transgressed that definition. This is a fairly depressing destination at which to arrive, but it's a long introduction to a more hopeful point, I think, and this is going to be incomplete, all right? In recent church writings, in the Catechism especially, chastity and sexuality seem to be undergoing an expansion of meaning that could help us avoid such a stark reading if we unfold them. First, according to the Catechism, sexuality permeates our whole existence. It grounds all of our relationships. Sexuality affects all aspects of the human person in the unity of his body and soul. It especially concerns affectivity, the capacity to love and procreate, and in a more general way, the aptitude for forming bonds of communion with others. Here, the heavy lines between love and sex and friendship and affection seem to be blurring a little bit. Secondly, the Catechism affirms the social character of chastity. It's not just about me, okay? It takes it beyond my delectations of touch and into conversations about justice and community. The point of chastity, according to the Catechism, is love. It's the capacity to give my whole self generously and undistractedly in loving friendship and spiritual communion. If we combine these two developments, we start to piece together a vision of physical affection that's not reducible to sex, okay? And that has a finality, as the Vatican would say, that is not exhausted by procreative marital unity. This expansion of vision makes temperance an ideal and welcome resource for dealing with the whole range of physical relations, not just sex, okay? And the expansion of the discussion to include the positive affective side of chastity in this way is really essential today. Because today these clerical breaches of chastity that we have known about for quite a while have been made extraordinarily public. And we are being called to ask how they occurred. The old culture of Catholicism has sometimes simultaneously treated touching as at least incipiently sexual and therefore forbidden outside of marriage on the one hand, or as irrelevant to chastity and purity and therefore as morally uninteresting on the other. So either everything is forbidden, don't touch anybody, or everything short of intercourse is allowed, the only moral question is when can we have sex, okay? This seems inadequate for all that we know now about the necessity of touch for human flourishing, and also about the potential abusiveness of so-called friendly touch. Touch might be more like food than the tradition has given it credit for. For example, as in bulimia, when extreme self-denial leads to obsession and to binging, aversion to normal affectionate touch could encourage uncontrolled sexual transgression. Is that one of our problems we need to ask? Finally, church teaching says that chastity requires the, quote, practice of an ascesis adapted to situations that confront us. This is precisely what the church has not developed and what would allow us a fuller capacity to deal with the Susanna story. Because in cultures that are long on patriarchalism and short on political and economic equality, men of means can take advantage of women's and younger men's poverty to exploit them sexually. In all dysfunctional situations, military occupation, prisons, addiction, sex becomes currency. In these situations where life and livelihood are sometimes literally at stake, not just for oneself, but often for one's family, how does a relatively powerless person survive with integrity? This leads to the question of justice. And this, I think, is the place where the vision of Veritatis Splendor is probably most lacking. The theological tradition has acknowledged connections between social justice and sexuality for centuries. We can talk about some of those. But most recently, it's joined commentators from across the political spectrum in saying that consumerism, narcissism, poverty, low wages, bad health care, unemployment, these are the real enemies of the family, and these are the real enemies of healthy sexuality. The church calls on people with power to ensure that economies and politics are organized in such a way that family life and healthy sexuality are possible. But these prophetic visions, although they're good and essential, are inadequate to the moral questions that we're facing. There are two problems. The first one's practical, and it's probably on all of your minds in election year, okay? Powerful people are rarely virtuous, and so they are not the first people likely to respond to the Pope's call for justice and equality, okay? Because their interests are at stake. The second one follows. Given that sin will infect the social order until the end of time, how should we behave now? Typically, official teaching addresses neither issue adequately. It does express sympathy for the pressures that married couples as couples face, thinking of China's one-child policy, for instance. But what John Paul II does not recognize in his rendition of Susanna is that garden variety sexual coercion involves imbalances of power not between couples and the state, but between sexual partners, like Susanna on one hand and the judges on the other, or like Susanna on one hand and Joachim on the other, okay? Not just the judges. For example, in countries where child sex workers are common, the church would obviously counsel men to stop visiting them, right? But until men utterly cease doing that, can a young girl who's coerced into prostitution acquiesce regretfully, biding her time until she can plan some intelligent way of getting out of that? No? Is that ethical? The relatively less powerful position of millions of women in comparison to their husbands and partners creates a situation in which refusal to have sex risks loss of livelihood for them and for their children. At the turn of the 20th century, Carol Davidson Wright asked whether women who were economically dependent on their husbands were any freer than prostitutes. And I think we should be grateful to Lisa Soul Cahill for asking some of those questions, I think, in your work too. The church warns men against allowing social inequities to permeate their intimate relations, and that's a good thing. But until men everywhere listen, can women use contraception? The question here is not about women's self-control in sex, but about their survival and their children's survival. Social justice thinking is the traditional Roman Catholic power tool, I would say. When the issue is defense of self and defense of other, moral absolutes do not apply. For instance, just war theory counsels us not to refrain from coercion and deadly violence, do not kill, but gives us permission to use it in a very measured way if it's absolutely necessary in order to preserve life and order. Do not kill unjustly. Radical nonviolence is permitted, of course, and even encouraged, but it's potentially self-sacrificial, and so it is not required of people. Similarly, we need a just sex theory for cases in which sex becomes the field on which power is played out, where the point is no longer sexual purity or marital fidelity, but legitimate self-preservation. Sin is no more easily uprooted from sexual relations than from international politics. For Susanna, a just sex theory would counsel giving in to the judges if doing so would have preserved her life. Resisting, like pacifism, would be allowed for sure, but it would be an act of supererogation and possibly not even an option for someone who has people that they need to take care of, who are dependent on them. There is much more to be said about pleasure and sexuality, about power, and about experience, and I hope that we'll address some of these topics informally in just a minute. But for now, I just want to reiterate, I think the greatest challenge facing Roman Catholic sexual ethics today is not merely to articulate the ideal vision of sex in marriage, which we must do, okay? But it's to bring the formidable power of the moral tradition to bear on sexual victims as moral subjects. How can we be sexually virtuous moral subjects in a world that will never be able to protect